それではですね、次。
Now, I would like to open up the next panel discussion. The title of the panel is Governance and Compliance, Management of Dual-Use Technology. Professor Shirayama, could you serve as the moderator? Yes, thank you. I would like to open the second panel discussion. As was mentioned, we will deal with the dual-use management in this panel discussion in terms of the disclosure of research results and security and trade control issues and so forth. Well, unlike the other panel, we have only 3 panelists in this session, so we have a lot of time for each one of them. We will have presentations from each one of them, and after that, we would like to entertain questions from the audience. 3 panelists talk about, first of all, the US case in biomedical research, what kind of conditions constitute the disclosure and constitute the restrictions and the control of the research results and so forth. That will be discussed by Professor Kame. And after that, we will see Japanese examples, especially from the security as well as the export control practices in Japan. Professor Morimoto will talk about it. And after that, we will discuss the issues surrounding those practices in Japan from Professor Ito. So first of all, let me invite the first speaker, Professor of Northern Arizona University, as well as the professor at the Translational Genomics Research Institute, Professor Paul Kame.
This is a great pleasure to come to your university and talk about this topic. I'm a scientist. I'm a professor at a university and also at a research institute. And so this topic of technology transfer is something that I've experienced from the university side. And in fact, it's one of the main reasons I'm associated with the Translational Genomics Research Institute, because translating and moving intellectual property into the commercial workspace is very difficult from the university standpoints. And sometimes you need an organization like a nonprofit to help you in that process. My research is in genomics. I work in the genes of different organisms, but in particular, I've worked on bacterial pathogens. The bacterial pathogens that I've worked on the most involve those that are involved with biological weapons. So I'm most known for anthrax research. In fact, my laboratory has worked on the anthrax attacks of the Aum Shinrikyo in 1993. And in fact, we analyzed the DNA from Tokyo after the cult sprayed anthrax over that suburb. But what I'll talk about today is a role that I played on a national advisory board for the last 10 years. I was one of the founding members of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, which advises the US government on dual-use research of concern. I was the chairman of this board for 3 years, most recently during some very controversial periods of time when dual-use research involving biological agents such as the avian influenza virus came to the board for policy decisions and policy discussions. Now, dual-use research in this context, we're talking about research that can be used for good, but also can be used for bad. We know that the biomedical sciences, the life sciences, and its research underpins very important things in our society. Biomedical and public health advances are made by life scientists, improvements in agriculture, the safety and quality of food is supported by this research, environmental quality, the ecology of life, and indeed a strong national security and the economics of our countries is dependent upon life sciences research. But unfortunately, we know that good science can also be used for bad purposes. This was driven home in the United States following September 11th, 2001, when a series of letters were mailed around the United States which contained anthrax spores. This use of a biological agent scared the American public and motivated the US government to regulate life sciences to prevent this type of occurrence from happening. There was a group put together at the National Academy of Sciences, which is one of our most premier institutions of science in the United States. And they came together, scientists from around the United States and policymakers, and out of this meeting, the meeting was carried out in 2002 and 2003. The report was finally published in 2004. And this is the Biotechnology Research in the Age of Terrorism report. And it was chaired by a scientist named Jerry Fink, and so sometimes we refer to this as the Fink report. So what they concluded was the same technologies that can be used legitimately for human betterment can be misused for bioterrorism. One of the recommendations of the Fink report was the establishment of an independent advisory board which would advise the US government on biological research and how it can be misused. It was established then the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. Again, I was one of the founding members of the NSABB. This board is a US government, we say USG, US government-wide initiative. So the board is actually advisory to all agencies of the US government. While we reported directly to the Health and Human Services Secretary, and we were staffed and run by the Office of Biotechnology Advisory, OBA, we actually were advising then all 15 departments and agencies that conduct, fund, or have an interest in life sciences research. So basically the entire US government had to listen to what we had to say. Now, we were charged with making recommendations on strategies for mitigating the potential for misuse of dual-use biological research. We had to consider both national security concerns and the needs of the research community as well. This is a very hard balance to strike. Over the last decade, we've been very prolific. We've written thousands of pages of recommendations, including the rationale for why these recommendations should be put forward. On this screen, then, there are a series of these different reports. Some of them involve how you communicate science to the public without scaring them. Others have to do with how you manage and regulate a new emerging field of biology, such as synthetic biology. I'll talk more about that in a second. We offered up a document for the oversight of dual-use research, which recommended a number of different things for how you manage dual-use research in a university and other environments. These reports are present online at the OBA website, and that the website is then listed at the bottom of that slide. You can go there, and I have to say these are very well written reports. We had an excellent staff who would correct our English whenever we made mistakes, which is often. So perhaps most important of all of our reports was the oversight framework for dual-use research of concern, or what we call DURC, D-U-R-C. We developed a framework for the oversight which includes steps in the local oversight of dual-use research. One of the most important recommendations we made was that dual-use research be regulated by the local institutions. Local institutions, universities, and research institutes must take responsibility for this and be the primary gatekeeper or regulator for controlling the misuse of biological research. We established criterion and guidance for identifying what dual-use research of concern is. I'll talk more about this in just a moment. But since all life science research could be misused, it's important to differentiate between the average level of risk and an elevated level of risk. We developed tools for assessment to manage the dual-use risks. We developed tools for the responsible communication of research. Often it's the miscommunication or irresponsible communication by researchers and scientists that inflames the public unnecessarily that is the biggest problem. we identified the responsibilities of those conducting the life sciences research, what is their role in this, and we also established a code of conduct for dual-use research. All of this is available at our website. Now, when you regulate research, and especially research of dual-use concern, there's a need for a balance. First off, you want to prevent the misuse of research, but on the other hand, you don't want to prevent the research from occurring if it's critically important for our national and global concerns. It's possible that even research that has great potential to be misused needs to be performed. And so you have to decide what type of regulation you will use, what type of safety controls you will use to prevent it being harmful. And finally, it's possible that in this process of regulating research to prevent it being misused, that you actually prevent very innovative and creative research that has no risk at all. So the regulation here has to be very carefully done, and it has to be balanced in a way that we minimize the impact on valid research and creative research from going forward. So part of this really has to do with distinguishing between average research and that which is of greatest concern. So, because most research has some potential, the goal here is to identify the subset that has the highest potential for generating information that could be misused, or DURC, D-U-R-C, which is different than from just dual-use research. Our goal is to identify D-U-R-C, or dual-use research of concern. So we came up with a definition or a criterion for identifying this. This dual-use research of concern then is research that, based upon current understanding, can be reasonably anticipated to provide knowledge, products, or technologies that could be directly misapplied by others to pose a threat to public health, agriculture, plants, animals, the environment, or material. So this definition of dual-use research of concern has a number of words in it which are very subjective. Okay, so based upon current knowledge means that we have to worry about research which can be immediately applied. Reasonably anticipated, those words mean that there can be disagreement. What is reasonable? You may think that one thing is reasonable, and I may think another one is. And importantly, it talks about directly misapplied. So dual-use research of concern is that which can be misapplied today, not 5 years from now, 10 years from now. It doesn't take any imagination or fantasies to understand that this could be applied today and have detrimental effects. So identifying dual-use research of concern is a very difficult thing. Now, as a part of this, we also identified 7 types of experiments which are particularly of concern. And so I'm not going to go into these in great details. These are technical experiments, but they involve the ability, research that would, for example, create an organism which was resistant to antibiotics or vaccines, or ones that could evade the immune system. And so there are 7 of these. We came up with these, and these were modeled after the Fink report. And in the Fink report, they were referred to as the 7 deadly sins. So these are experiments that are of great concern. Now, very importantly, these experiments could be critical for improving health or protecting health from future biological problems. And just because they're of concern does not mean they can't be done, but they have to be done in a very careful and thoughtful way. One of the concerns that arose after the anthrax letter attacks was a concern that the scientists themselves were not responsible, were not caring. In 2008, the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, identified an American scientist as the perpetrator of the anthrax letter attacks. When this information became well known to the public in the United States, they became very suspicious of scientists and thought that scientists were in fact the problem here. We believe the NSABB came back and made recommendations relative to how we can change this. First off, we think that there was no need for a nationwide program for regulating scientists. Rather, we recommended that, in fact, at local levels, there be a system that would create a culture of responsibility. So a culture of responsibility is something that scientists need to develop internally. So we need to be able to develop this culture where we promote ethics and we promote behaviors and conducts that will help build confidence in the American people or in the global people, as well as in governments, that scientists are doing things correctly. Now, the scientific process is not just a one-time event. It starts with perhaps an idea, the conceptualization of our product. And then once in America, once we have an idea, we have to get funding or money in order to do this research. Once we have that money, we conduct the research. As we start getting data and findings, we go out and we discuss these research findings at scientific meetings. We start to go through a publication process which involves peer review, and eventually then we hope that we publish these scientific articles in scientific journals so that the world can know about it. This culture of awareness and responsibility must be embedded in scientific researchers so that they consider this, the potential for misuse at every one of these steps. And so it's not just you can't just put a check in place at the very end of this process when things are being published, but rather it has to be embedded in the entire process. One of the things that I would like to advocate here is, in fact, this cannot be something done by a single country. It has to have international engagement. It has to be done on a global basis. There has to be some type of a culture of responsibility for all scientists in all countries. And so the NSABB has made a number of recommendations. Again, you can find these on our websites for how you promote these types of ideas in an international setting so that, in fact, the consideration of dual-use research is something that goes across countries. Now, in the last 3 years, when I was chair of the NSABB, when I was chair of this board, a particular set of experiments came to the forefront, and these are what we call gain-of-function experiments. Scientists were taking pathogens and creating new functions, new biological properties in these pathogens that were very disturbing to people in the public, as well as many of us on the science side of the board. So in this case, the gain-of-function experiments, the definition would be when a pathogen gains a novel biological property, either through traditional methods or through advanced genetic engineering methods. An example of this would be mammalian transmission, increased virulence, conferring drug resistance, antibiotic resistance to a bacterial pathogen, or manipulating a pathogen so it could evade the immune system. Now, the mammalian transmissibility in particular, this gain of function, was an experiment that arose during a couple of high-profile scientific papers. And in fact, one of the scientists involved was a Japanese scientist named Yoshi Kawaoka, who was working at the University of Wisconsin in the United States. And he was working under the funding of the National Institutes of Health, or the US government. The other scientist was in the Netherlands, illustrating then that this issue of dual-use research is an international one. Well, so the avian influenza H5N1 virus is a virus that, as the name implies, is one that infects birds. And it has devastated birds across much of the world now, killing chickens and ducks. And only seldom does it infect humans, but when it does, it's deadly. So there's about 600 cases, known cases of human infection by the H5N1 influenza virus, and it's 60% of the time the people die. So the mortality rate is incredibly high and very scary. So these two research groups, one in the Netherlands and one in the United States, conferred the ability of the thing that saves us from a major global pandemic in humans is the fact that these human cases, when they get infected, do not transmit to another human. So it's a dead-end infection. So these two research groups began to study the mutations and the genetic material inside the H5N1 virus to understand why that was the case. And sure enough, the two groups both figured out you could change the genes very slightly by traditional methods of selection or by new genetic engineering methods, they could figure out how to make this virus transmit human to human to human. So the potential was there that this virus could get into the human populations like our normal seasonal flu that we deal with, and it could take off and, of course, create a global pandemic. But in this case, the mortality rate at 60% could be deadly. So these papers, two papers, one in Nature and one in Science, the two of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world, came to our board, and our board said, you know, you really shouldn't publish all this information, not until we have a vaccine or drugs or some other thing that would help prevent a global pandemic. And so this became very controversial about whether we could publish these dual-use research of concern. So this is an example of dual-use research and an example of where the process early on did not work and where it became down to the reviewing of scientific papers at the very end to determine what should be done. Another example of this was the 1918 flu. In 1918, there was a flu virus, the H1N1 virus, which swept around the globe, maybe killed 100 million people at the end of the First World War, so in 1918. This virus was perhaps the most deadly virus to ever encounter the human population, and most of these deaths occurred in about a 6 to 8 week period. No part of the world was spared. Scientists in the United States went back and resurrected this virus went extinct, but scientists in the United States went back, determined the genetic sequence, and reconstructed this virus to understand exactly why it was so deadly. This was a very scary thing for the US population, and in fact, with that genetic sequence available, then the fear was that anyone could get access to it. So this would be an example of a dual-use research of concern and needed to be done in a very careful fashion. Finally, the last example I will mention is synthetic biology. This is Craig Venter. He's very famous. He was one of the first, he was one of the leaders and pioneers in determining the human genome sequence. He has started a company, this is a private concern, which is expert at what we call synthetic biology. He was able, from chemicals alone, to create the genome, all the genes of a particular bacterium, and get it into a living cell. So synthetic biology has incredible potential. Craig Venter says that the new economy of the world will be based upon these synthetic approaches to biology, where we can take a bacteria or an organism, engineer it how we want to create whatever we want for the good and the benefit of mankind. Of course, the fear here is that someone could create something very deadly as well, and that in fact they could create a pathogen that we would have no defense against. So here again is an example of dual-use research of concern. And this particular area is very problematic because this technology is becoming very accessible to many different people, even people who want to set up laboratories in their homes. And believe it or not, in the United States, there are hobbyists, or people who have a hobby of creating new organism and biology in their homes, in their garages, we say. So there is a document that we've put forward suggesting different guidelines for how to deal with synthetic biology. But I will tell you that our guidance and recommendations here are still not adequate. We do not know how to control synthetic biology. We do not know how to regulate it. And it is an area of research that will explode and be very, very important. And there are very few safeguards with that. So with that, I'll just leave you again with a slide. This is my final slide. This is the slide where you can go and see our reports. We've spent a lot of time talking about this. As a scientist, I have encountered over-regulation many, many times. We've had to deal with export controls. These regulations and export controls may be important for controlling the misuse of science, but they definitely have an impact on inhibiting science, inhibiting research, and developing new ideas and approaches and scientific findings. And so the balance between regulation and letting science be innovative and creative is one that we're going to struggle with. There's no simple answer to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Kame. Now we would like to invite the speaker from Japan. First of all, from SISTIC, Export Control Advisor, Mr. Morimoto, could you start your presentation? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am Morimoto, Export Control Advisor at SISTIC. So SISTIC means Center for Information on Security Trade Control. That's the English name for SISTIC. It's an NPO or NGO for export control, especially for the we are bridging the gaps between the private sector and the government. Recently, we also help universities, research institutes, because recently academia we have to manage the export control. Therefore, we are helping or bridging the gaps between the government and academia as well. Earlier today, there was a discussion about the export control. And export control constitutes only a part of national security. However, for universities, it is quite burdensome to have a export control practice within the universities. So I will cover the overall picture, and Professor Ito later will cover the situation in universities in Japan. Next page, please. I'd like to talk about why today export control became so important in universities. Well, there is a concern about the proliferation of many things, such as mass destruction weapons. This has been a case for some time. There are three types of concerns when we think about proliferation. So one is a continuous proliferation. The second case is in whether in universities or research institutes, the existence of sensitive technology. That's the second case. Well, in Japanese universities, not so much military research is being done. However, it doesn't mean that there is no dual use research concern in universities. It's not the same thing. Universities and research institutes also have technologies that can be potentially used for military purposes. Another area is like the joint study cases with overseas. It is not rare recently in Japanese universities do joint researches with others. The third area is internationalization. Internationalization itself is not bad at all. It's a quite ideal thing. However, under this context, if you put together all of the number 1 through number 3, if universities, research institutes, it's unthinkable that they do something bad intentionally. However, when it comes to proliferation of mass destruction weapons, it is possible that for universities and research institutions to be involved unintentionally because of what they do. And that kind of risk cannot be avoided. You cannot make an excuse that you didn't know, and then you will not be excused. So that's the kind of awareness, first of all, we have to have about the risk. On the other hand, from legal perspectives, in 2009, the foreign exchange and the foreign trade law has been amended in Japan. So that encompasses today universities, research institutes, as well as industry, and they are obligated to have ICP, that means internal control programs, on their research activities. So as an organization, universities and research institutions are obligated to have the internal process to have export control. So that amendment of the law was a wake-up call for universities. So up until 2009, it doesn't mean that the universities were not subject to such obligations. However, because of the formalization of the rules, there was an effect of a wake-up call at that time, back in 2009. So universities and research institutes, they do have internal organizations. First of all, they have to establish ICPs, but in fact, there are many challenges and issues that they are facing with regards to this. Because in the beginning, the word export control itself was not familiar at all in universities. Next week, I'm going to conduct a training program in a certain university in Japan for export control. I don't think there will be many people in the audience. It is because of this problem. Well, first of all, universities tend to say that they are not exporters. So when I say I will talk about export, they don't come because they are not involved in the export business. However, in fact, in reality, universities, in a strict sense of law, they are engaged in export practice in a strict sense of law. But even if I say that only verbally, they don't still come. And also the word control. It's not the taboo, but many people in universities do not like the word control. So either when I call this export control or control, they don't like to attend the conference or attend the training session. So that's the awareness problem. I'm sure that the people in charge of export control in each universities are sharing this concern or problem with me. So when we say export control, if we try to apply this to university research activities, how should we interpret them for researchers? I don't have a good interpretation. However, I would like to get some feedback from the audience and get your expertise on this. One way to think about it is when it comes to researches or research results, they have to have a certain control over them. Well, a genetic recombination or IPs, those things are required. So it is the same thing. Secondly, our organization, SysTech, is always introducing best practices. We have accumulated 20 years worth of best practices accumulated through the industry. Therefore, but this expertise available in industry cannot be applied directly to academics. And also, those best practices from industry are accumulated over the experiences of industry alone so far. Therefore, active participation of the academia is necessary in order to interpret the results into academic context. So to do that, we also have to have awareness to the people involved. We cannot give orders to people in universities. So in order to elevate the awareness, we cannot give an order. We have to motivate them to participate. So we have to give them awareness about the problems and concerns about the dual use. That will be the first step. When we go into the actual practice, there are many different challenges, which Professor Ito will be sharing with you later. But I want to say that we have to start with the awareness raising at the beginning. My last slide is about further thoughts. We have to have awareness raising, but it's not about the export control. We have to bring the awareness about dual use problem. It's not export control itself. That is the kind of problem that I want to talk about with you. For the government, society, and academia, we want to discuss this issue and bring the awareness together. As I said, researchers do not like the word control as well as export control. So they don't want me to come to the university to talk about this. And I do understand their feelings. So there are dichotomies such as freedom versus regulation and so forth. People talk about this problem in a dichotomy. However, when we try to share the understanding or awareness among different people, we are both stakeholders. That's the way of thinking we have to have. In that sense, the Fink report, which was mentioned earlier, is not about export control. However, we can learn a lot from Fink report about the possible approach that we can take, the possible way of thinking that we can apply to export control. From the side of academia, they have to have a self-control so that they don't have to fight all the regulations and the restriction coming from outside. Well, it was being done already in life science, and we just have to extend this to other areas. And this kind of approach was not existing in Japan, and it's quite new in Japan. Therefore, it's different from export control, but we can learn from Fink report. One key word here is accountability. So this is the accountability for researches or research results, and this is what we need as well. So I don't think export control is everything. Export control is just a part of the picture. However, we have to ensure accountability for export control. In order to strike a good balance, what kind of accountability do we have to define for export control? That is what I'd like to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite Professor Ito from Gunma University. Professor Ito is the president of the Japan Society of Intellectual Production, JSIP. I'm sure he can give us a lot of practical cases on this particular topic. I'm Ito from Gunma University. I am acting as the president of the Japan Society of Intellectual Production. Please allow me to introduce myself. I worked in the R&D section of a private company, and I moved to Jikei University Hospital as a researcher. I made publication, I supervised students, and over time, I shifted my focus to the university industry collaboration. I'm here to talk about export control system. However, I have to admit that I'm not the expert here, and I'm also not a legal expert on the export control. Please allow me to introduce Japan Society of Intellectual Production. We facilitate the collaboration of different sectors so that we can improve the intellectual productivity as well as enhance the value of the output. So universities will collaborate with the external organizations, and sometimes such collaboration will give immense impact on the universities. And there are lots of compliance issues that needs to be well understood by university. One of such is the export control system. As Professor Watanabe asked me to give you a presentation, and recently we have compiled the request for the overall export control system. So I would like to touch upon the request or petition that we've submitted. But before that, please allow me to go through the background. In 2008, the plan for 300,000 exchange students has been established by Japanese government. And in accordance with that, MEXT, who oversees foreign exchange law, took the leadership and initiated the export control system campaign. In around 2008, I think more than 100 explanatory sessions were held at universities by MEXT, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry. And in 2009, Japan Society for Intellectual production created guidelines for establishing and practicing a voluntary control system for security trade and security trade control guidelines for university researchers. We created these guidelines in collaboration with METI and MEXT. ICE recently created English version of these guidelines, and we put them up on the website. That's a very good English textbook for foreign students. So if you are interested, please come visit our website. And then in 2010, standard for export control system was enforced. With this, even the university organizations are requested to have a system to comply with the export control in Japan. So if the university doesn't have such system in place, that means that university has nothing to do with the overseas organization. Researchers on an individual basis when it comes to nuclear power were quite active in exchanging with the overseas entities, and they always referred to the guidelines of the METI advice. And so prior to 2010, those researchers are always referring to the relevant laws and rules to have a good control of export system. So this time we have submitted the request regarding the export control system to mainly Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, METI. And our request also went to MEXT, Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology, which supervises higher education. And also our request also went to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which supervises foreign students' acceptance. And we worked together with the Intellectual Property Association of Japan, as well as Center for Information of Security Trade Control. All those organizations, including our organization, worked together to compile the comprehensive request to those officials. And in our request, there were 20 proposals made. I don't think I have enough time to go through all of them, so I would like to go through the highlights of our requests. So this is the main point of our request. Number one is the matter related to education. Number two is about the definition of basic science research. Number three is seeking for the government support on the acceptance of foreign students. Number four is about the provision of information and management tool, which benefit the management of export control in the university. In most of the universities, they set up the export control office, and sometimes the people who used to work for the same section in private sector came to work in the university export control office. And there were lots of confusions now. And those confusions were summarized as identified problem, and that was included. First of all, for the undergraduate students, undergraduate student also needs to refer to the export control system, but this existing textbook which is available in the market is considered to be publicly known knowledge. However, when it comes to the new textbook, which is not commercially available, depending on the content, sometimes mixed needs to regulate. This indicates that undergraduate student study may be regulated by the law. That would generate confusion. That may generate confusion. So we asked the mixed to give us the proper guideline as to what to do with the new textbook, which is not commercially available now. And universities do have a lot of instruments, listed instruments. And if foreign students who are not the resident of Japan were to use those listed instruments, we need to be aware that those listed instruments are regulated by the mixed. However, the purpose of various instruments are not, in most of the cases, harmful. So we ask them to deregulate the use of listed instruments by foreign students. But when the foreign students reside in Japan for more than 6 months, they are no longer considered to be foreign. So they are not to be regulated. However, in the initial 6 months, if the foreign students were to use the listed instruments, and then they have to comply with the regulation. So in around late last year, Mixed compiled the FAQs and posted it on their website to clarify some of the gray zones. So if the use of the listed instruments by the foreign students are legitimate, the Mixed now says that those use of instruments is not to be regulated. Now, I would like to talk about the basic science research. This is outside the scope of regulation now. But what is the definition of basic science research? What is basic science research and what is not? According to the Mixed, it's about the clarification of the mechanism of the natural phenomena, products, actual tech. It says that the intention is not to talk. It's not about establishing technology. So when a university collaborates with the overseas company in terms of what we call basic science research, if it's outside of the definition of the Mixed, that may be regulated by the Japanese government. So the question is, we don't really know the clear definition of basic science research. When it comes to engineering, oftentimes engineering can serve the social benefit. So that can oftentimes be considered as basic science research. But it all depends on the interpretation of the Mixed. So we need to have a clarification of the definition itself. Next is about the foreign students. Foreign students who are on their government funding, and then the MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, grants them a visa and accept. And they look at the purpose of the study and so on. currently, universities decide whether or not they should accept the applied foreign students by themselves. There is very low involvement of the government itself in deciding whether or not we should accept such foreign students. And our request is to ask for the larger involvement of the government, because acceptance criteria can vary from one university to another, and this is not good. We believe this is where government should intervene, introduce consistent acceptance criteria. There is a plan to accept 300,000 foreign students, and we shouldn't just be talking about the numbers. We need to look at the quality as well. What is the scope of listed instrument? That's not crystal clear. So we ask the government to provide a management tool for export control. Sometimes government can make decision for a certain area of science. However, when it comes to university oversees a variety of scientific field, and one or two people alone cannot say yes or no to the concerns over the potential harmful activities or technical field. So we ask government to give us some tool to check whether listed instruments are harmful or not. So the use of instrument in the universities, last November, Mixed posted the guidance on the use of instruments in the university, and METI made a table which contains both listed items and technology which is useful for the voluntary export control system in university, and they have taken some other actions so far. So today's theme is the dual use. As Professor Morimoto said, if we have a proper export management, we may reduce the risk of export control. When universities have overseas collaboration, this is one of the most critical issues, I believe. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have three gentlemen presented. And just a little bit, we would like to sort out the overall big picture, and then we would like to receive additional comments. Or if there are any questions from the panels to the other panel members, that will be welcome. And Mr. Ito said that it is really, it boils down to the management of dual use. Engineering and technology contribute a society, but at the same time, it may pose a threat to the security. So it has both aspects. So how we can put them under control, that is really the point. So after all, it is really the sense of the ethics among the researchers, those who are working at the front line. But as Professor Ito said at the beginning, this concept has been already implemented and incorporated in systems. Cultural responsibilities or the ethics issue is one, but how we can create the governance in a system institutionally, and those are the two fold approaches that we can take. And I thought that those were the main points from your presentations. And then if there are any additional comments, I would like to receive them from the panel. As Professor Ito said, that there are some differences depending upon the fields. So, example, nuclear technology or the space technologies, and there are already structures established, or maybe new areas such as genome and genetics. And as Professor Kim said, that the biotechnology, biological field, that's exactly the field that he worked in. Maybe it doesn't go to nuclear, but the adjacent field, maybe chemical. For example, for disarmament, biological weapons and the chemical weapons stipulated by the two different conventions. So the biochemical and the others, how are they different? So nuclear, maybe nuclear space and Air Force utilizing more of a traditional regimes. So how we can also bridge the gaps in this different situations across different disciplines. And my point is also related to the case Professor Ito said. As Kim said, local responsibility is very important to put a control, and that's, I think, is a very practical baseline management of the dual use. But is it okay to leave everything up to the local institutes? Probably that's not exactly the case. As Professor Ito said, probably whether to accept the foreign students or not, that's also part of the export elements, export control management. What kind of institutions that the foreign students belong to. It's quite difficult for a university to identify their backgrounds. But if there is some system and structure, maybe we might be able to drum up support from the university more easily. So as a government, what do they have to do? And as the institutes, as the local institutes, what is the level of the responsibilities that we have to fulfill? So there is a demarcation of the responsibility between the two parties. And in Japan, we have a trade law, foreign exchange law, and this is a kind of the topic that we need to defer to the ministry in charge. Maybe a certain level of the control is done federally in the U.S. and some are delegated to the state level. So I think there is also a balance issue between the central government and the local governments. And now the overall theme, achieving a topic is the globalization. Now more activities are globalized. Voluntary control also requires some globalization. I talked about whether the whole thing should be done by local institutes. And then I think that's also related to the fact that what level of the management can be done globally and what level of the management can be done locally. And the flu virus has been also mentioned. Oka professor, actually, he was, I think, in the School of the Medicine. However, called in a joint research with Wisconsin, and then eventually his reports were published in the Nature and then other trade magazines, professional magazines. So therefore, the U.S. protocols were utilized. So we also need to create an equivalent system. That's one way to work out the situation. And now everything is globalized. It's quite difficult to control everything locally. So therefore, maybe it may be a good idea to make good use of the existing international regimes. So while listening to the three gentlemen, I thought that these are the main points that I captured, and of course you can build on my comments. But after listening to other presenters, if you have other points that you would like to address, you can also feel free to make comments. Professor Ito, you just raised hands, so please be the first speaker. Now, individual awareness and how the management is to be done. I think those are two separate points. Literacy. The reason is if there is no literacy, well, I don't like this law, so I want to ignore it. So especially among in the science researchers or professors, they are not interested in such thing, and then they hide. And in universities, many things are kicked off with reports filed or forms filed. But if the literacy of the individual researchers are quite low, then there will be no filing. And the activities will be hidden. And then eventually the activity is revealed and then lead to a disaster. So that means that the education and enlightenment is very important to raise the literacy. That's my point. Thank you very much. I think that was a very important point, and probably institutions and the systems, industry and academia collaboration, and those who are at the forefront consider it. But if we try to put them into words as a description, it's quite difficult, like the dilemma of the dual use, or as a researcher, you need to ensure that the academic freedom, but at the same time, some activities need to be controlled. Otherwise, certain level of the liberty will be deprived of. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to really operate the system. Ms. Morimoto, please. So, I'm not the researcher. I'm specialized in law, so therefore I'm in the position to be enlightened, educated by the professors. But each professor tells me different things. But as an organization, what do we do if there is no answer? In terms of the accountability, for the formality, we just say that we are not doing it. But even as the professionals, it's quite risky to say that I'm not doing it. I'm not following the compliance. And the literacy, lack of the literacy, actually, you are ignoring it because you are not inconvenienced by ignoring it. So I think you should create a system so that they will be inconvenienced. And this is an opinion from some professor in the literacy field. So what's easy to understand is that unless you do properly, you will not be able to get the funding. So it's actually outrageous act to ignore what's being stipulated, codified in a form of laws. So therefore, that's my comment. Thank you very much. And probably my interpretation is that not at the individual level, institutional level, compliance is very important. Even at the individual researchers level, they have to go through the proper procedures. Of course, there is no one single solution, panacea, but looking at the balance, you have to ensure and leave the evidence so that you can prove that you have taken proper approaches. Yes, exactly, you're right. Hedging the risk is very important because you are controlled, and then you don't like that. Anybody wouldn't like that. But you did proper steps, so I'm justified. In a system, that's very true. Yes, I think this is exactly the topic that will be discussed in the afternoon associated with the misconduct. So as an organization, it's very important to oversight. And unlike the past, we really have to play that role. And now, Kim, would you state a comment?
This is a great discussion. You've raised many important points. I'd just like to follow up by pointing out that life sciences are more difficult than some of the other areas like nuclear technology. To control nuclear technology, sometimes you can focus on a particular piece of equipment or perhaps on the radioactive material itself to control it. In the life sciences, this is very difficult. For example, in synthetic biology, so we have export controls on many types of organisms, pathogens, microbes, DNA. But now, with the age of information and genomics, if someone sequences the genome of a particular organism, a pathogen, it's quite possible to export that by the internet. And so this, in fact, is very difficult to control, and especially when it's related to basic research. So there's no one system that is going to solve all of our problems. And so we really are trying to advocate for a personal responsibility at the scientist and researcher level, that there's some type of an oversight at each institution where they're promoting that as well as monitoring the implementation of this culture of responsibility. And then at the national and federal level, there can be enforcement via funding. In fact, in the United States, almost all regulations of research is done by controlling the funding, because the federal government is the source of most of the funding for researchers. Very few of the regulations are actually laws that are passed by the Congress or by the government. These are almost all regulatory by the agencies that are controlling funding. If you don't implement a system of reliability in your workers, we aren't going to give you any research funding. This is a very strong motivation for institutions and for individuals. Finally, then, we have to have a system that's international and goes beyond governments. There is no easy solution to the global engagement except for that scientists can do this, governments can do this, and try to promote standards where we're all kind of following the same rules. So on the international level, maybe one of the most difficult tasks ahead of us to try to get standards. When we've done outreach to developed countries like Japan or to Europe and the United States, people look at us and they understand what dual research is and what the problems are. When we go to the developing world, they say, we're worried about Ebola. We aren't worried about dual use research or export controls. We're just trying to feed our people. So there is definitely a first world, third world gap in these issues as well, and yet we have to engage everyone on a global basis to make this work.
ありがとうございました。それではちょっと少し。
Thank you very much. We still have some time, so we'd like to open up the floor for questions. Can you pass out the microphone? Thank you very much. I am. Do I need to state my name? Is it okay if I don't? No, please, if it's okay. My name is Hoshino. A very meaningful discussion I observed, so thank you very much for that. While listening, standards.
Of there's a regulation, I think.
And I'm sorry, I will be speaking from now on in Japanese. In the case of Japan, those are standards. Like, who decides that standards? Where do we have that law? So standards or regulations. So who decides what violates the law? So if you know that the total body who decides that, so I think Mr. Morimoto will be the perfect person. Actually, in terms of the law, there is a foreign exchange and trade law. But as for the details, we have ordinances, and so we have a sub-ordinances which actually decides. And who makes that decision? Who makes those rules? We have the division of the responsibilities. Well, it's a diet who deliberates them and actual specifics. As for the international harmonization was mentioned by Paul, and actually among the advanced countries, the same level of the control has been established in COCOM, which existed in the past, but that's no longer there. But there are subsequent international frameworks for discussion. So whatever discussed and determined there are applied. And in the case of the Japan, foreign exchange trade law, and then also the subsequent ordinances. And of course, as for the actual laws, Diet decides it. And as for the regulations and international laws, will there be some linkage? So is there a connection between the national laws and the international standards? Well, I said that the international discussion framework exists. So this needs to be controlled, or maybe this may be controlled under permission. It may be utilized for the nuclear bombs, and that's called the NSG Nuclear Suppliers Group. So there are respective bodies, but they are not the international conventions. So therefore, you will not be held liable for the international obligations. So it's voluntarily left to each country. So could you be brief about your question? So I will be brief. My name is Takeuchi. I have a question to Kaim, Paul. A dual-use dilemma was mentioned earlier, and the results of the research are to be checked. So to check the use of the research results, universities or the institutes and the governments and the industries. So these three worlds, respectively, need to have functions of checking. Do they exist? And is there also an integrated public organization who have a control or who oversights the use of the results of the research activity? So I would like to understand the current status of the U.S. organizations. Well, I think advisory board that he founded plays that role. So academia, industry, in the economy. So what kind of people need to be assigned in academia? Of course, self-checking cannot be done on your own. So societies needs to play a role, and then some people, some researchers, experts in other industries may have to play.
Is peer review of research, and that's of course a very academic function. And in government, the government also is open, so the documents that are in government are almost always open and can be reviewed, and so publication would be the best way. The gap in this whole process is industry. Private industry, of course, frequently relies upon secrecy, and they're also not controlled very well by funding sources. So academic researchers and, of course, government researchers will respond to the threat or the promise of funding. But in the United States, at least, private industry does not have the same responsiveness to regulations if they don't have some tie there. So research at a private institution that involved dual-use research would have to be voluntary for the most part right now in the United States.
それは強制的に何かして
So that means that the forceful checking, so there is no legal obligation so that individuals have to go through that checking, and they are not disclosing. That's because of the patent, because of the existence of the patent.
Sometimes there is an obligation. So there are laws for certain things, the way you use animals and the way you use human subjects in clinical trials. Some of these have been codified in the legal system, but much of it has not been. Most companies in the United States, in an ethical and responsible way, are responsive, though, to standards involving, human subjects, for example, and for the use of animals, and also now for dual-use research of concern. And this has been something that we've established through education. Thank you
very much. So,
はい、すみません。よろしいですか。
May I? Just one more person. Very interesting talk. My name is Hoshino. Now, regarding the security, there are advanced species or there will be some evolution of the species. As a country and as a university, as a research institute, is it really possible to create an organization who can supervise such activities? I have a great concern about creating an umbrella supervision. So what you're trying to ask is that we talked about the local management, right? Local oversight. But how can we verify the functionality of the local oversight? Will it be done by federally? Is that the point of the question? So does anyone have anything to say? Okay, Professor Ito first. So for those who understand this fine set norm, genetically modified ones, legally, control is required. Or chemical substances have been already regulated by law. Even the research institutes under universities have to comply with the legal requirements. So chemical substances or use of the biological entities, all the university offices have to abide by the rules. So it's just awareness or the mindset. If a research office has a spy, a hidden spy, and then he or she puts the substance on his body and then takes it out from the research activities. Of course, there are so many scenarios that we can simulate. But given the discussion we had so far, as Mr. Morimoto and Professor Ito said, there is a legal framework. And what I'm saying is that, for example, when we are accepting the foreign students, we have a system to verify. And if some goods and facilities are to be utilized, of course, they are under control. Any regulations cannot be implemented and enforced 100%. But a certain level of the enforcement has been already controlled. And as Professor Kame said, life science is quite difficult, unlike other fields. So there is a level of ease in the discipline. So nuclear is difficult, but some others are difficult because it's really up to the individual, like a genome sequence information. What is the level of the information can we manage? That's quite difficult. And even in terms of the regulation, it's quite challenging. So as Kim pointed out, Professor Kim pointed out, it's a balance issue. So can we stop it? But actually, conducting the research activities also entail social benefits. So we can't really stop the research activities altogether. So what do we have to do? That is exactly the dilemma. And then given that, they are trying to be ingenious. Paul Kim, Professor Paul Kim, do you have anything to comment? Additional comments?
Not much. Very well stated. It's important that we don't get into a trap of fantastic scenarios. There are always ways to scare ourselves, and especially as professional academics and as scientists, it's important that we don't do that to our citizens, because sometimes they will react in a very negative fashion and it will hurt themselves and hurt the scientific endeavor. So we need to be realistic and take care and help develop confidence that scientists are actually trying to do good, because scientists almost always are trying to do good.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you so much. Even I think that this point that he also pointed out in his presentation, scientists have to respond in a realistic fashion, and if an excessive reaction is conducted by the scientists, then that may unnecessarily scare the public. So we went over the time by 7 to 8 minutes. So I would like to now close the second question. All the panelists, thank you very much. And those who asked the questions, thank you very much for your active participation. Thank you. And now we would like to conclude the morning session, and the afternoon session will start at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.